Hi, Decoders. This week we're exploring community as a conscious lifestyle choice. What does it mean to crack open that nuclear family story? Is there something more fulfilling? Let's explore it. Hi, I'm Kiran Trace. Welcome to Humans Decoded, a story of hobbits, fairies, elves, dwarfs, gnomes, and humans. If you get lost at any point, there is a deep dive on all the different avatars in episode 1. It includes notes. Thank you for joining us in a fun little chat about the vast potential of our human makeup. Hi, Leela. Hi, Cami.
Hi, girls.
Hi, Decoders. Hi, Leela and Kiran. Community. I feel like it's a big one and we've never really tackled it. So it's hugely influential in our lives, whether you have a big community or not. I think the people that you surround yourself with can be an enormous influence. And when you're in community, it gets more amplified, so the influence is even stronger. And I think it's really fertile ground for everyone to get carried away or for your own stuff to get really worked up to the surface and seen. And it feels like very clear leadership is necessary, or a very sort of availability to own your own stuff and stand in what's true. And so if there isn't that, it's the breeding ground, or it can be, for all sorts of things. And recently, Leela came to stay with me for a week, and it was just so sweet, such a grace. It was amazing to have someone who's, very clear, like Leela, but also inside of my house, inside of my space where I could go blind and get really indulgy without anyone checking on me. And there's just, when you're sort of in that close proximity, there's nowhere to hide. There was nowhere to retreat with my own stuff, because we're in this sweet little apartment. So it's just there on display. And especially when there's more clarity around you, it does put pressure on what's not clear. So it kind of pressurizes the bullshit out. So it makes it look extremely clunky very quickly. And then it's exposed, which is a great thing, even if it's very uncomfortable maybe. But it was a huge blessing. Leela's laughing. I was like sweating a lot, just being like, oh my God, you're going to see all my stuff. It was just really ripe to come to the surface. So anyway, I'm a big fan of community, at least in this context. When it works, it's very beautiful.
And obviously vice versa, no? And I'm so happy to talk about this, because I feel like it's very en mode. It's very in to want to live in community, to live your sort of utopia, to want to live a different life than the maybe very tight shapes or normative shapes that we might have learned from our families. But I see that a lot of, living in community is very, very spaced out. So I'm wondering if and how sane community can work. Because as Cami was sharing, I know it also for myself, it's tremendously helpful to go live with Cam for a week, or to live with Kiran for a couple of months. Helpful in the way that it makes me see my bullshit so much more clearly than when I'm in the swamp of it, completely blind to the swamp, And on top, it's just infinitely lovely to share spaciousness in a way, like making dinner and watching a show in this field of silence with your bestie. However, if there isn't the access to the vast field of silence, probably any attempt to live together just tanks? I don't know.
Well, I really like that the three of us are talking about this, because I feel like, once again, we each have a lot of expertise, but in different areas of this. So when we're talking about living in community, we're talking about making family structures more bigger than the nuclear family shape. And it could also be smaller, ironically, than the nuclear family. Like we might call it living in community, and it might be, one parent, their child, and their partner and their partner's kids, but they're not living like a nuclear family. They're living like two families that share communal ideas, but also have independent space. So we're talking about breaking down that family structure or redefining it. So it's something I think that all humans actually desire. It's about connecting together, but also having independence. So it's family sort of as a word has a connotation of a lot of intimacy and sort of a specific way of doing something. And then when we break it up, we go community, it sort of opens up this idea of something it could be a little more spacious, or there's more people involved, or, they're big words, but we're talking about like this vision that like most humans, especially if they start doing some self-awareness work or start looking at their own family backgrounds or family patterns, they start to see that there's this vision of like, what would it be like if there was like a whole bunch of people, right? Like if there's a whole bunch of parents and a whole bunch of kids and a whole bunch of or a whole bunch of adults who are really sane, living together. And obviously, historically, there's been a lot of cultures around the world who, are based in this concept. But it's really, really challenging. So even though part of something inside of us hears this call of a utopian vision that would support our human development or supports human fulfillment, it's really, really challenging. It's a risk. It takes a lot of sanity if it's going to work. So, okay, sure, we're all going to live together in some kind of compound. And who's going to lead? What are the rules? How does it work so that everyone's needs are met? And, I have rarely seen a successful community. Meaning by successful, I mean it supports everyone's developmental needs and brings the best out of everyone. So when I have seen it work, it's usually this like a family compound sort of thing. Everyone has their own house, and inside of those walls, they live by their own rules. But there's these community events like shared meals and playtimes, events, holidays. But even then, the really successful ones, they still have to define community values in common. And then to live in alignment of those values, the really successful ones I've seen, they have therapists and support people that everyone is seeing. And therefore, everyone has the same tools. Everyone shares the same language models for what the needs are and what best is for each person. So to point to a really successful one, the musician Brandi Carlile, she's an American singer-songwriter, quite famous, definitely having a moment right now. And she has a community like this, and she's very, very public with it. She owns a very large piece of land outside of Seattle, Washington. Many of her own family members have their houses on that land, and they raise their families. And by family, for Brandi, some of that is her blood, her sisters, her brother, her cousins, but some of them are her family, her band members that she's been touring with for 20, 30 years that also have, that's also family. They share the same group of therapists. They share the same, values. They work towards a similar value of what it means by sanity. And importantly, for this one to be pointed to as so successful, there was already a sense of mental balance. So 20 years of touring with these band members, there was always this focus on people having mental balance and also quite a lot of self-awareness before the land was bought and the houses were put into place. So there was these steps taken for that. So everybody who came to live there was really deconstructing any dysfunctional patterns consciously and in the same rule book by having the same group of therapists, etc. And I don't want to trigger anyone with a word like sanity. So to define it, it simply means that the mental and emotional loops are not indulged. They're not followed, no matter how captivating, how gripping. Instead, a common truth or like real world, like realism is followed. So sanity means we don't follow the thoughts or emotions so much as critical thinking, as discernment of what's true. And so decoders, we would call that reality. When Leela was talking earlier, she was talking about this field of silence, this infinite field of quiet. For me as an awakened leader, as Leela, as Cami, as being awakened beings, that for us is the place that we would say real world. We would point to that as real world. That's a very specialized language. Most humans are not accessing that. But we can say that realism is available for everybody instead of mental and emotional projections. And we learn that. We learn that in self-awareness. We learn when we're projecting mentally, we're projecting emotionally. And this can be really simple or really challenging, depending on the day, the trigger, the trauma, because we all have our fair share. But that's the risk, I think, both Cami and Leela, you guys are both talking about, like when we live alone or when we're on our own or in our own habitual patterns, right? There's a free for all indulgence in the emotional and the mental, and it's not being necessarily caught. And it can be really uncomfortable to be caught there unless there's a lot of sanity in the people catching it. So a lot of people who aren't interested in the emotional or mental drama and are pointing us back to a realism.
I just love that kind of tour so much. I think I've always had a desire to sort of live in sanity. Maybe I didn't have the words for it. But back in the day, I used to spend a lot of time living in Portugal with the Muji Sangha. So I'd be there for 6 weeks at a time, or a couple weeks, or a month, several times a year. And it was kind of, in some ways, a very fulfilling experience. There was, so much silence and breakthroughs and a really beautiful Sangha. But I think looking back on it, I had no sense at that time that individual needs could serve the group. Also, I wasn't in touch with any of my needs. And so being in a big cohort where there's so much structure, because you get assigned tasks and roles, and I was part of the video team, and we were busy like 12 hours a day, and there was like this rush. I just never had to make any decisions for myself, which suited me great. And I think if I ever went back now and were to stay for an extended period, I would be bringing to it a lot more tools, a lot more awareness of, delicious yes, or sort of what my yes is, because it's not always easy to hear it in a group. And being more aware that hearing that yes, or that need, or that no, or that boundary that comes up for you, it's serving a deeper intelligence. So I don't know how it would play out if I, were to do that again. Probably very differently, and I would have a lot more language to, just be like, this is what I want. But yeah.
I think when we talk about living in community, and maybe some of you decoders are in this camp with me, one of the challenges can be this very strongly set, very baked in story of a nuclear family. Like for me, for instance, I grew up in a nuclear family, mom, dad, my siblings, and I've been raised to believe that this is the valuable shape for a life, even though it wasn't a shape I particularly thrived in. Like it felt like there was no space for me, and I wasn't just loved the way I was, only if I showed up in the right shape, if I somehow played child right, if that makes sense. It was very much a one-size-fits-all dictate, which obviously did not fit me at all. So my experience growing up was a lot of, somehow I must be wrong. Nevertheless, I was moving towards just replicating this shape when I lived with my ex-partner. It's all been set up to just be another nuclear family, you know. We moved in and we planned to get married and to have children that we would raise, just the two of us. So almost all my life, this is what I've been wanting and where I've been moving towards. And as we are recording this episode and talking about community, I'm still coming to terms with the fact that it is probably one of my pain bodies, one of my belief systems who still gravitates towards that shape. So there's a fear to truly leave this story behind and allow myself to dream different versions of living with other people, you know, truly go for living in community, because it's just so very unfamiliar for my conditioning. And I think we can all feel in ourselves how this unfamiliar, the unknown, is a very scary place for our pain bodies. Because there, they have no point of reference whatsoever. They have no pillars they can hold on to. However, I would like to add here also that how when I'm witnessing nuclear families, you know, whether it's friends of mine who live like this, or I observe families in grocery stores, and when I witness this family, I often witness a complete checkout state in the parents, very, very disconnected. And I get kind of an anxiety about this shape and the way such a life seems to be set up. Inside of me, there is a scream that says, run as far as you can. So clearly, that version of a family based on effort and compromise is not at all what my being wants. Even though I've been raised to believe that, your being wants that.
And I think many of us, most of you decoders are listening, the loneliness of our family structures growing up were a big part of what brought us to self-awareness or self-discovery. And often, even in our lives, that loneliness, we can hit against it. And so we have this, like, sometimes what might be this la-la vision of, I just want to run away with a community of like-minded people, and we're going to remove ourselves and live in a different way, you know? And in that different way, the loneliness will be absolved. And what's interesting is that if we take it out of the la-la and we look at what's real, you know, which can just be a desire to have our needs met, and people around us don't abandon us for it. So we can live in a connected, warm space where the people who live with us want, like, what I'm calling the best for us. You know, like, everybody's really invested in your authenticity, your own desires, the unique call of yourself. And, you know, those of you decoders listening that were either raised in a nuclear family or currently living in a nuclear family know that is, it's a big task when there's, you know, just living in a household of, you know, 2 adults to 2 children or 3 children, you know, if there's more children than adults, like, it starts to be very, very, very difficult in our old set of tools on how to get needs met and how to really embrace the authenticity of everyone's being. I don't want to indulge the story that it is hard. You just need different tools. But, you know, I'm coming to this conversation as someone who's pretty much always lived in community, bigger community, didn't really live in nuclear family. And mine were always very successful and quite wonderful for the most part when I did. So, and I just also want to say, like, that's what's so cool about these conversations. Leela has this really strong nuclear family framework, but has visited successful community. Cami has these beautiful examples, whether it's her boarding schools or her living with Muji, of living in a community that wasn't entirely successful because it wasn't about personal needs or authenticity. It was about a group structure, where then I come in with like, nope, totally wonderful, perfect community. Totally focused on authenticity and needs. So it's really interesting. But even I rarely see it work well. But when I was 19, I lived in the most wonderful community, and I lived there for more than 12 years. It started with this group of very young artists, meaning like young adults, so early 20s. They moved into this old house. The locals called it the Grub House, because all of these people, all of us, would sleep in these little sleeping bags, like 20 little sleeping bags all curled together on the floor like little grubs. The actual name of the house was Daisy House. And that winter, everyone lived there. Or sorry, that summer everyone lived there, but then the winter came and it was too cold in that old house. And the old house was separated from town by this frozen river. So everyone moved across the river closer to town, to this old shipyard right on the river's edge. And it was a rundown group of old buses and old shanty shacks on a piece of Aboriginal land. It was sort of like 3 or 4 people to this like little one-room shack or a bus. And it was a playground for young adults and young artists. Everyone was an artist. We lived as a family. Some people had jobs that winter and they bought groceries and, like everything we needed. And other people chopped wood and other people made food. Some people did the maintenance, some did the cleaning, some did the sewing, and it was just very communal. And every night there was big bonfires, there was singing, jams. Sometimes it was just a giant group hang. And the thing is, this group of 20 or 30 people, they just really moved very beautifully together, like little grubs. And so sometimes it was just like all night talking, little grubs in their little sleeping bags. But it was very, very beautiful. And, eventually there was just a couple of years in the shipyards. Some people stayed for a long time, but eventually most of us moved to this other kind of a cottage village, tiny bit more upscale. The cottages, you still had to haul water. There was no electricity, but adorable little postcard cottages in the woods. And they were all really, really close to each other. So just right out of, your child's imagination, right? There was a pond, big pond. And it had this very sweet little grocery and gas station and all kinds of fun essential things. But the community was still very intermingled. And I lived there for a decade. And every Sunday there was a sauna on and a group brunch, and almost every day after work there might be a soccer game in the field, or capture the flag, or hiking to the hot springs. There was always a kind of activity happening, and it was really wonderful. And it brought out the best of everyone. And ironically, it wasn't conscious. It wasn't conscious at all. But there was a collective vision. And the collective vision was more about being grounded, being resourceful, being democratic, being playful. It was a very haul water, chop wood, joy is in the simple things kind of point of view. Cook from scratch on an open fire. It was a very educated group of young artists. So there was a collective vision. Everybody had a university education. And that's, of course, where you learn critical thinking. That's one of the only places that you learn critical thinking for real. There was a lot of high-level book reading, high-level discernment, because this is just who this group of people were. And all of them lived away from their family of origins. So there wasn't a religion or a theory or a philosophy per se that people were consciously subscribing to. It was just kind of a rural instinct, living on the land, making your own food, making your own soup, making your own living, making your own soap. And this love of magical connections, like the magic of the northern lights and the magic of a perfectly baked pie pulled from a fire. and a collective love of just sitting for hours in front of a fire, just singing, just storytelling. There was a lot of fostering of compassion and kindness for anyone who might be caught in personal pain from a family of origin root, because this is a band of young adults, young artists away from their family of origin. And this slow life was building compassion for small things. But, there was a lot of focus on fun. There was dress up party games, and there was, all kinds of adventures all the time. One whole winter we played poker every night, and you would bet the most funniest things you could build or create that week. Like someone had a Chinese communist Mao Zedong shaving kit. And that week, that was like the highest thing to gamble for. Another week, it was just someone had so skillfully waxed a bundle of perfect kindling to light effortlessly any fire in the middle of the night. And wow, that went for high dibs. A lot of like, I'll see you a haircut over a foot massage. So like a lot of imagination, a lot of connective play. And I would say that was a big part of the success recipe. People building out their own family network based on a communal value of like fun, but having this, everybody's university educated, everybody's referencing these sort of high level discernment skills. But it's my karma. It's my destiny to live in communities that are really successful. And when I was born, and I've mentioned this on the podcast before, I lived in a community with my neighbors because my mother was a key community builder. And it was such a sweet, profoundly successful community going on in a suburban neighborhood in downtown Toronto, Canada. On one side of the street was this beautiful Indian family from Pakistan. And on the other side, the most wonderful Indian family from New Delhi. And we were like the middle house. And my mother connected these houses to a tradition they already knew very well in India, like to live in these family compounds. And because it was their culture, it was very seamless to live like that. And so it really was just like one family in 3 houses. And honestly, till I was 3, I didn't know that I only had one mother. I thought I had 3 mothers. I thought I had all these brothers and sisters, and so I was born into that. And I lived there for a short time, but then of course I was, kidnapped by a bio dad and step monster, and shit got super fucking terrible, and it was really abusive and tragic. And, nobody wants to know the details of that awfulness. But in my 20s, life put me back into community. And, I met the little grubs at Davy House. And even now, I live in this big, beautiful villa with many en-suites, and people come for these long spells. People come and go, but there's a lot of joy. There's a lot of play. There's a lot of focus on, what we call our delicious yes. We have this single point of tools. We have a single point of common language. So I would say I've spent more of my life living in successful community than out of it. And I would still say it's very, very, very rare. But which is funny, because in reality, we really do so much better in that kind of communal system. It's a simpler way to meet our needs and meet personal fulfillment. But there's so much risk involved that's so challenging. The risk it takes to have a shared value, the risk of the responsibility for self-awareness, this huge amount of self-awareness, the risk to have compassion as a primary focus. And of course, I think there needs to be a shared vision of playful fun for it to work. And a lot of us don't live in our homes with a vision of like, we're here to live by having a lot of fun. Let's just go have a lot of fun. It's a lot more about productivity and becoming something and doing something important. um, so a successful community is quite a recipe, and it's a risk. But obviously, many cultures worldwide live in a community model, and Cami, who comes from Guatemala, although lived all over the world, has, that's an indigenous culture that lives in a lot of community. But are they successful? Are they personally fulfilling? Or is there like some kind of abusive leadership or very conservative governorship that wants to limit human expression? Because then it's potentially dangerous. So to dismantle the nuclear story or the story of a dominant leadership and let value lead instead of personality, and to really have enough critical thinking on your side. Alternatively, the default is a community that has a domineering rule structure in which people just practice the surrender of their personal needs. And, that's just not a recipe for successful human fulfillment.
As we've been chewing on this episode, I can notice some stigma in myself that maybe communities are like a little weird. They're for hippies. And I think it's just a fear of the unknown, but also there's some baggage I'm bringing to it. I grew up in a Catholic, conservative, upper middle class household where there was a lot of fear around anything that doesn't follow the rules of convention. And so, I don't know, I remember my mom pointing at someone with dreadlocks once and being like, if you ever look like that, I'll disown you. And so there was a ton of like kind of micro throwaway comments and threats like that, but then there was some legit ones where they're like, if you don't follow the straight and narrow, like you can't be part of this family. So I think there's a little bit of that conditioning left over, and then I never realized it before, but I went to boarding school for a few years towards the end of my schooling, and I guess that was an experience of living in community, and actually it really suited me. I think I thrive when there's a lot of structure around me that I'm not responsible for maintaining. And there were a ton of things about boarding school that I really liked. Like we all went for dinner together, you do your homework at the same time, you hang out with your friends pretty much 24/7, and every moment is accounted for. So, there's like breakfast at a particular time and lunch at a particular time and dinner, everything's like clockwork. Except, however, on Saturdays where we'd have all this free time and most of my friends were involved in playing sports and I was not. So for the first time in the week, I would have this chunk of time on my own. And then this despair would come up. And I guess the busyness of the curriculum kept that at bay. And then when I left boarding school, I went to live with my sister in London. And it was the first time I was without structure. Like I was going to university, but sometimes we wouldn't have classes, or you'd have like 2-hour lectures and that was it in the day. So it was the first time I was faced with like all of this alone time, and oh my god, the despair that had been kept at bay suddenly caught up with me. And many years later, I now recognize that despair, and I'm actually very glad it was so loud for me, because it made me look inward from a very young age and not keep chasing external shapes or busyness to find peace. So, that's where we are now, which is pretty cool. And so, yeah, fast forward to, having had to face that despair over and over and over again. And then gradually there's just much more peace and access to source that infiltrates my life. Now I have the wonderful privilege of living with Kiran and, a few of our besties in her estate for a few months of the year. And what does it look like when everyone in that camp has dealt with their own despair, looked at their own baggage, like untangled, made some real transformation, and is resourcing inside of source and has very good communication skills? Like it's amazing. Like it's awesome. So I'm definitely coming around to sane community living. And I always had a fair amount of, I guess you'd call it community, or just like people around me growing up. I was kind of raised by my nanny. I had lots of siblings and step-siblings. We had a big extended family and lots of cousins. But everyone had shared values, and it's fair to say, like, it wasn't sane in that, you know, people weren't valuing truth or authenticity. So I think getting to be intentional about spending my time with people with more aligned values now as an adult brings its own kind of healing. It gets to be a choice I make based on my own needs and desires versus something you're born into or thrown into, whether it suits you or not. And now being able to land in a place that is open to my needs, wants to hear my boundaries, wants authenticity for all, it's amazing. And even though it's amazing and it sort of like levels me up in a way that I couldn't do on my own, it doesn't mean that it's less triggery. In fact, I would say it's more triggery because you don't get to go to sleep around very self-aware people. So if your sort of bullshit is playing up, it stands out like a sore thumb and gets called out immediately because it kind of gets in the way of this very effortless flow that's dominating. So yeah, if you show up with your shit, it's suddenly like very loud in the room. And, you know, I thought this episode was going to be just about living with my bestie for the past week. But now I'm seeing that there's a whole much wider, much more fulfilling parameter for how to spend your time on this planet. And there's almost this kind of grief that the only thing I was sold was nuclear family.
Honestly, this episode has already inspired a ton of reflection in me on what do I want in terms of living with people? How do I want to live family? Because there's definitely still a desire for a kid, for a partner, and in my ideal world, that is happening within the bigger shape of life in community. Because, you know, I do have the experience now of how incredibly fulfilling it is to live with sane people. For instance, every summer at retreat, we practice in seemingly small bits what it means to live with each other without having to sacrifice or deny our own needs. And then, of course, I stay for a few months with Kiran, and that's where we really go for the experience of living with each other. And as Cam was saying, it is incredible. I'd say it's such a profoundly healing experience for me, and I think for all of us, to live family, in this case chosen family, as a place where your yes is wanted, where your no is wanted, where there isn't this this is what we're all doing today and you have no say, or, well, one must compromise in order to be with people or in order to be loved. You know, we all share the same commitment to delicious yes, and you've heard us talk about this in the podcast. It stands for this embodied sensation of deliciousness, which indicates where truth is in a moment, a shared commitment to consensus and truth. And I don't think there's a more healing place than this, honestly. I don't think I got that until a couple of years ago when it dawned on me, like, oh, here's where I truly learn how to do this. Like, it isn't just a given that you actually have the skills to live with each other, the way my nuclear family story made me believe. But to stay in and dare to listen for what's true in a moment with another, or even with a whole group, which is, in a way, a listening to the unknown instead of jumping to familiar things or things I think I know. And that is a lot of courage. But man, the wins that come from it, I remember, for instance, one day where it was a bunch of us at the house in California, and there was this idea to go rent some boats to explore a gorgeous lake nearby. But things like logistics and who can come to support various needs, etc., all that wasn't immediately clear. And I remember we were all just staying in and listening and daring to speak our yeses. And in the end, it's been one of the most beautiful days ever.
Yeah, that day sure is like this happy place for me. It's like when I understood what they mean by, oh, we're making memories. And, we have had so many, just the summer of our lives, living as a community. And ultimately, like in this conversation, you may not know where to go for that, but you may be recognizing an impulse in yourself of like this utopian story. And it's a wonderful opportunity to expand the idea of what that could be. If you're single, maybe there's a group of friends, maybe you have a vision, maybe you each buy houses in the same neighborhood, or you can, it can have all kinds of various movements throughout it. Maybe you and your cousin and your best friend, but it's a risk. It's a real risk and a challenge of what would that be like, to maybe look for 2 houses or 3 houses, or look for one house that has 3 units in it. But I think more and more of our world is starting to break out of these enclosed stories like a nuclear family. And the more self-awareness we do, the more we recognize that connection, warm connection with other humans is a learned skill, but it's where fulfillment can be. So what does that look like? Is it 3 brothers who have 3 cabins beside each other, or is it like, your ex-partner, your children's dad and you and your partner and your sister-in-law, and you get 3 boats in the harbor and you live in the boats together. Like, I don't know. And maybe you don't know either, but we're just wanting to speak to that call inside of you and really what it takes.
That's so cool, having new templates of what community could look like. Imagine if we all had this growing up, like knowing that there was so many more options than just living in a nuclear family. Like, yes, please, let's normalize living with your ex-partner / baby mama, or collectively buying a house with your besties. Like, what fun.
Yeah, and I think we do a pretty good job at retreat each summer in making this a little bit more experiential, what we're talking about, no? And sometimes it's people's first time discovering how ideal it can be to lead with your needs and desires and to be seen, and how okay and safe it is in community.
Oh my god, yeah. Some of my best memories are of those first retreats where it would take all the courage I had in the world to just say like a tiny need, like, I want to leave lunch early. But to see how that played in a group where everyone's gunning for delicious yes and the play and joy and many miracles that ensue. So I say I want to leave lunch early, and then 2 people are like, oh yeah, me too. And then it turns out like we all want to go to the spa, and then it turns into this miraculous day. And just getting to take those like first baby steps of being authentic in the world inside of that really, really sweet container. I mean, it was life-changing. And all those people I met, I mean, they're my tribe.
Speaking of retreat, early bird registration is opening at the end of the first week of March. So just be on the newsletter. Make sure you get your regular newsletter that we send out once a month or something, and you'll see the notice. But early bird is $500 discount on the price of retreat, and those seats sell really fast. And so the newsletter list, which is you decoders and people in class and people in community, you get first dibs to those seats. So make sure you sign up. There's a link below in this episode. And we look forward to chatting next week.
See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye, decoders.
Thank you for listening. We obviously love hearing what you think. Your feedback helps us make a better show for you to listen to. So feel free to comment, and you can do it at Facebook, which is the Humans Decoded podcast. And if you're not on social, you can always email any questions to us at outreach@kirantrace.com. And thanks for listening. We love you.